Haute horology is the name which, when used in the talks of horology, would almost always refer to watches with attention to detail and craftsmanship that is representative of art, finesse, precision, aesthetics and beauty. The second name that suggests a high-end watchmaking is when you say steel luxury watches. And this was the concept that was introduced by Audemars Piguet in the form of Royal Oak and then followed by Patek Philippe in the form of Nautilus. These were the watches that not just introduced the concept but also set the steel luxury watches into a trajectory where steel watches started being priced more than many precious metal watches. The master designer Gerald Genta is the name you will quite possibly come across frequently as the person who conceived and designed the Royal Oak and Nautilus. Vacheron had their own ideas to compete with the other two Holy Trinity watch manufacturers, and then taking the ideas of the same integrated bracelet watch and then a bezel with complicated and edgy corners. Vacheron had their own design presented in the form of 222 in 1976. Now that the 222 is not produced anymore, we see referred to the overseas as the evolutionary form of the original 222, with the current model reinvented in 2016. While Vacheron make a claim that the current overseas as we see today is a descendant of the original 222, it is worth noting that there are basically no design resemblances or inspirations between the two. Rather, if you look at the Vacheron 222 and compare it with the overseas, they are basically two completely different watches that not just look entirely different but have completely different sizes, different thickness, different aesthetics and basically completely different experience on the wrist. There is one common attribute between the two though, and that is they are both integrated bracelet watches, and maybe a second one too. They both have the same manufacturer, Vacheron Constantin. While it is a watch with different aesthetics, it comes with its own attributes and design cues. Starting off with the dial, we have a beautiful blue dial here that comes with lacquered treatment. The shade of the dial here is interesting, where it looks like a black dial under most of the lighting and ambience. But when the light hits it right, you start to see the hues of blue, which add a very interesting and unique character to the dial, where the black looking dial leaves it as a more versatile watch for day-to-day wear. When the dial plays with the light, it turns into flashy blue and the overall experience changes from versatile watch to a fun watch. Another thing that is rarely spoken about, and I didn't know myself as well until I just analyzed it for this video, is that the dial here is actually sunburst too. And then since the paint method here is lacquered, you get the experience of lacquered dial, but then the sunburst lines continue to remain very clearly defined and obvious. And if you notice the dial on your blue overseas to be playing with the light radially along the dial, and you were wondering how and why, you know the reason now. While the sunburst lines are very clearly defined in this particular example, I could unfortunately see some defects in the painting process and some haphazard and numerous abrupt black marks along the dial. These imperfections can't be spotted or seen with naked eye, largely because of the darker shade of the dial. But the point here is not just to show what can't be seen with the naked eye, rather to show how much attention to detail has gone in the making of this watch. The dial hands come with multiple facets that are fully polished to not just allow them to reflect light playfully, but also to help with the legibility for time reading. The dial hands are also filled with luminous infill to allow time reading in the dark, and we will look at the lume shot shortly in the video. The seconds hand comes fully polished too, but there are no bevels or chamfers, and the overall execution looks fine. There is a beautifully scalloped bezel with 6 corners That adds some complexity and interesting character to the looks. And the all-polished bezel adds a nice contrast to the otherwise brushed top surfaces of the case. While the dial on the overseas is simply spectacular, the crystal on top, unfortunately, has no air coating on it, and it reflects light almost all the time. You would mostly be distracted by the reflections from the crystal while trying to enjoy the beauty of the dial. If you saw my last two videos I did on the overseas, I mentioned that I find the date window, the font, and the overall delivery to be poorly executed. Each time I looked at the 4500V, the date just looked off. I couldn't gather what was the reason, and I decided to analyze it this time. Looking closely, not just the date font is too small for the size of the date window, but if you notice, for example, the digit 8, the right side of the print 8 is thicker than the left side of the same digit 8. If you look at the bottom of the digit 1, the corners are not equally wide or even sharp. We can see another date, and the unevenness between the digits can be seen with corners that are again not sharply defined. We can even just look at single digit date, and the quality of printing, unfortunately, is again not quite up to the mark. Speaking about the dimensions on the watch, the size of the case measured at the outer extremity of the bezel is 41mm, and if you measure the size of the case from 2 to 8 o'clock position, the size returns the reading of 41.9mm. So while we see marketed as a 41mm watch, I personally would call it as a 42mm watch, and it does look and wear big. To measure the size of the dial, I checked the size of the crystal on top, and it is 32.8mm. So the face of the watch is also relatively large, and it is not a small watch, and it does not look small. The bracelet at the case is 23.6mm, and it goes down relatively flat and tapers down to 19.9mm, or let's say 20mm. So the bracelet tapering here is very subtle, and the bracelet overall is rather chunky and wide. Size to 6.5 inches wrist, the watch weighs at 155 grams, so it is also not a light watch, but that is not to say that it is a heavy watch as such. The watch case is also relatively thick at 11.2mm, and for me personally, it is a touch thicker watch if you wanted to use it primarily for dressier occasions. The case sides are all polished with a beautiful chamfering at the corners. The top surface of the case are all brushed, and so are the bracelet top surfaces, and that add a nice contrast to the watch. The watch comes with a screw-down crown that has Vacheron's Maltese cross embossed on it. The third generation overseas comes with an in-house movement caliber 5100. The movement is overall large at 30.6mm and fits a larger case nicely, allowing the date window to be pushed out all the way close to the rehod. The movement offers beautiful finishing with all the haute horology characters on offer, including Côtes de Geneva stripes, circular graining, polished and beveled bridges, polished screws, 22-karat solid gold rotor with brushed, polished and even sand-blasted finish. And then there's a Geneva seal to add that touch of luxury, elegance and excellence. With this watch, not just the dial plays with the light, but also the movement itself has a story of workmanship to show when you allow it to play with the light. The movement operates at 4 Hz and comprises of 172 parts to offer 60 hours of power reserve. I checked the accuracy of this movement and timed it with a digital watch. After 22 hours of observation time and changing the position of the watch multiple times, this watch lost 4 seconds, which is indeed not a very impressive accuracy for a watch from 2021. Putting the watch in indoor lighting conditions, you can see how the dial changes the looks, and against direct light, you get those hues of blue that really look stunning. Turning the lights off, we have a dial with all the hour markers and dial hands that are fully lumed. The lume is not very bright with overseas, rather it is quite weak, and leaving the watch in the dark for only 5 minutes leaves the lume, unfortunately, close to dead. On the wrist, the overseas wear large, and while it is marketed as a 41mm watch, I think it wears and looks bigger than that. The minimum span on the watch is also quite large at 51.5mm, and that's because the first link after the case on both ends tapers outwards before the second link sticks straight down. The watch case is also thick, and it is not a thin watch by any means. Accordingly, the bracelet is also thicker at 4mm at the case. So there's a lot of feel of steel around the wrist with overseas on. The bracelet also doesn't taper as much towards the clasp. Rather, it stays relatively flat, leaving it as an overall a little chunky watch from the case to the clasp. The blue on the dial is indeed beautiful, but you will have to find the lighting conditions to see the blue, and it will mostly look black. The bracelet is all brushed with fine polished edges between the links to add that sleekness to the looks. Thanks to quick bracelet change system, as I discussed in my video above, you can change the looks of the watch between the bracelet and the strap in a matter of only 5 seconds. And this is one of the easiest watch bracelet systems on the market to swap with strap without basically any risk of damaging or scratching your case lugs or the bracelet. And obviously, without the need of any tools at all. Vacheron Constantin Overseas 4500V is a watch from one of the Holy Trinity Haute Horology and the oldest watch manufacturers to exist. And it does in return offer some interesting characters like a lacquer dial with sunburst treatment, quick bracelet change system, beautiful movement with 60 hours of power reserve, and then a scallop bezel and integrated bracelet design. But it comes with its own limitations. The date on the dial is quite poorly executed in general. The crystal is very reflective and takes away the joys from the dial. And there were some defects in the dial in this particular example. It is thick, chunky and bulky, and while it is marketed at 41mm, it is a larger watch even if you just measure the case size. The accuracy of the movement is also quite not there. And then the bracelet that doesn't taper down as much towards the clasp. While it is rightly a competitor of Royal Oak or a Nautilus, when you look at its case thickness of 11.2mm, it really is not quite there. And then while VC marketed as an evolution of 222, in my eyes, it is not. And it does not have to be a 222 to hit the sweet spot. It just needs to find those missing ingredients. I almost reiterated a third time.